The chandelier-lit ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel glittered with opulence, its golden glow reflecting off crystal flutes and diamond-encrusted wrists. The annual Crescent City Charity Gala was in full swing, a magnet for the elite, where power and prestige mingled over champagne and whispered deals. At the center of it all was Elise Moreau, her emerald gown hugging her pregnant frame, her smile polished but fragile, like glass on the verge of cracking. She stood beside her husband, Victor Langston, a real estate tycoon whose name carried weight in every boardroom from New York to Dubai. His hand rested possessively on her lower back, but his eyes roamed the room, scanning for the next handshake or deal to seal his empire's expansion. Elise, 6 months pregnant with their first child, played her part flawlessly, charming, poised, the perfect trophy wife. But beneath her serene exterior, a storm was brewing, one that would erupt before the night was over. The gala's host, Julian Cross, was a name whispered in awe and envy. A billionaire tech mogul who'd risen from obscurity to dominate the AI industry, he was as enigmatic as he was powerful. His presence commanded the room without effort, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through people. Julian's company, Nexus AI, was the talk of the tech world, its innovations reshaping everything from healthcare to global markets. Yet, despite his wealth and influence, he remained a mystery, rarely seen at events like this. Tonight, though, he was front and center, delivering a speech about the gala's cause, funding clean water initiatives in developing nations, with a charisma that held the room captive. Elise watched him from her table, her fingers tightening around her glass of sparkling water. She hadn't seen Julian in 7 years, not since their tangled past had unraveled in a way that left her heart in pieces. 7 years ago, Elise and Julian had been inseparable. She was a bright-eyed grad student, studying environmental science, while he was a scrappy coder with big dreams and no money. They'd met at a university hackathon, where Julian's brilliance outshone everyone, but it was his quiet kindness that drew Elise in. They spent late nights in his tiny apartment, talking about the future, her dreams of saving the planet, his of building tech that could change lives. Love came fast, fierce, and all-consuming. But Julian's ambition was a double-edged sword. As his startup gained traction, he pulled away, consumed by work. Elise begged him to slow down, to choose her over the endless grind. He promised he would, but promises turned to apologies, and apologies turned to silence. When he missed her birthday for a pitch meeting, Elise walked away, heartbroken but resolute. She never told him she'd been accepted to a prestigious fellowship abroad. She just left. Now, standing in the gala's glow, Elise felt the weight of those years. She'd rebuilt her life, marrying Victor 3 years ago after a whirlwind courtship. He was charming, successful, and offered the stability she craved after Julian's chaos. But stability came at a cost. Victor's charm masked a controlling streak, one that had grown sharper since her pregnancy. He dictated her schedule, her outfits, even her diet, all under the guise of care. Elise tolerated it, convincing herself it was temporary, that he'd soften once their daughter was born. But tonight, as his grip on her waist tightened, she felt like a bird in a gilded cage, wings clipped but still dreaming of flight. Julian's speech ended to thunderous applause, and the room shifted back to mingling. Victor leaned in, his breath hot against Elise's ear. "Don't embarrass me tonight," he murmured, his tone clipped. "Stay by my side. The investors are watching." Elise nodded, her jaw tight. She glanced at Julian, now surrounded by admirers, and her heart twisted. He looked different, older, sharper, the boyish softness replaced by a man's confidence. Yet those gray eyes were the same, the ones that used to make her feel like the only person in the world. As the night wore on, Elise played her role, smiling through small talk with Victor's business associates. But her eyes kept drifting to Julian, who moved through the crowd with effortless grace. When their gazes met across the room, her breath caught. His expression flickered, surprise, recognition, something deeper, before he masked it with a polite nod. Elise's heart pounded. Did he know she was here? Had he seen her name on the guest list? She hadn't expected to feel this rush, this pull, like a tide dragging her back to a shore she'd sworn never to revisit. Victor noticed her distraction. His fingers dug into her arm, a silent warning. Focus, he hissed under his breath, smiling for the benefit of the group around them. Elise forced a laugh, playing along, but her skin prickled. She excused herself to the restroom, needing a moment to breathe. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter, the muffled hum of the Gala fading as she leaned against the wall, rubbing her temples. Her reflection in a nearby mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, polished, but hollow-eyed, the weight of her choices etched into her face. Elise. The voice was low, familiar, and it sent a jolt through her. She turned to see Julian standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Up close, he was even more striking, his tailored suit accentuating his broad frame, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice steady but laced with something raw. "Julian," she managed, her throat dry. "I didn't expect to see you here." A lie, but a safe one. She'd known he was hosting, had seen his name on the invitation, but hadn't anticipated the effect of seeing him in person. "Nor I you," he replied, stepping closer. His gaze dropped to her rounded belly, and his lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Congratulations. I heard you got married." She nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. 3 years now. Victor Langston. The name felt heavy on her tongue, like a confession she hadn't meant to make. Julian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I know who he is." There was an edge to his tone, one Elise couldn't place. Before she could respond, Victor's voice cut through the air. "Elise, what the hell are you doing?" He strode toward them, his face a mask of controlled fury. The hallway, once a refuge, felt suddenly claustrophobic. Victor's eyes flicked to Julian, narrowing. "Cross. Didn't expect to see you slumming it in the hallways." Julian didn't flinch. "Just catching up with an old friend," he said smoothly, but his eyes stayed on Elise, searching, as if trying to read the truth behind her composure. "Friend." Victor's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Elise doesn't have time for friends, especially not at events like this." His hand clamped around her wrist, pulling her toward him. The movement was subtle but forceful, and Elise winced, her free hand flying to her stomach protectively. Julian's gaze darkened, his posture shifting, like a predator sizing up a threat. "Careful," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "She's pregnant." Victor's smile was cold. "I know my wife's condition, Cross. Stay out of it." He tugged Elise closer, his grip tightening. The pain shot up her arm, but it was the humiliation that stung more, the way he treated her like a possession in front of Julian. "Victor, please," Elise whispered, her voice trembling. She hated how small she sounded, how weak. But before she could pull away, Victor's hand lashed out, a sharp slap across her cheek. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, a crack that seemed to freeze time. Elise stumbled back, her hand flying to her face, shock and pain blurring her vision. Julian moved faster than she could process, stepping between them, his body a wall of restrained fury. "Touch her again," he said, his voice deadly calm, "and you'll regret it." Victor laughed, but it was brittle, nervous. "You're threatening me. At my gala." He took a step forward, chest puffed, but Julian didn't budge. The air crackled with tension, the kind that promised violence if pushed too far. "It's my gala," Julian corrected, his tone ice cold. "And you're done here." He signaled to security, who materialized from the shadows, their presence a silent command. Victor's face flushed red, but he didn't resist as they escorted him toward the exit, his protests fading into the hum of the ballroom. Elise stood frozen, her cheek stinging, her heart racing. Julian turned to her, his expression softening but still intense. "Are you okay?" he asked, reaching out but stopping short of touching her. She nodded, though tears pricked her eyes. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. But as Julian's gaze held hers, she felt the weight of everything. Her marriage, her choices, the life she'd built and the one she'd left behind. And in that moment, she knew the night was far from over. The gala was a glittering spectacle, the kind of event where wealth draped itself in velvet and champagne, where every smile was calculated and every gesture scrutinized. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms across the ballroom, their light dancing on the polished marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and ambition, as New York's elite mingled, their laughter a carefully curated soundtrack to their power plays. At the center of it all stood Elise, her emerald gown clinging to her frame, accentuating the gentle curve of her pregnancy. She was radiant, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her eyes sharp despite the weight of the evening. She was here as the wife of Victor Langston, a millionaire real estate mogul whose charm was as polished as the Rolex on his wrist. But tonight, the host of the gala was none other than Julian Hawthorne, her former lover, a billionaire whose shadow had never fully left her life. Elise had known Julian would be here. She'd seen his name on the invitation, embossed in gold, his signature flair for understated opulence. She'd braced herself for the sight of him, for the memories that would flood back like a tide she couldn't outrun. What she hadn't anticipated was the raw tension that would erupt, the collision of past and present that would unravel her carefully constructed world. Victor had been drinking, his usual restraint eroded by the open bar and the pressure of maintaining his image among the city's power brokers. His hand rested possessively on Elise's lower back as they navigated the crowd, his grip tightening whenever someone lingered too long in conversation with her. She felt it, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way his jaw clenched when Julian's name was mentioned. Victor had always been jealous, but tonight, his insecurity was a live wire, sparking with every glance she received. Julian, by contrast, was the picture of composure. He moved through the room like a panther, his tailored black tuxedo accentuating his lean frame, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet intensity. When their eyes met across the ballroom, Elise felt a jolt, a memory of whispered promises and stolen nights. She'd been young when they'd been together, a struggling artist with dreams bigger than her bank account. Julian had been her muse, her confidant, the man who'd seen her potential before she'd believed in it herself. But their love had crumbled under the weight of his family's expectations and her own pride. She'd walked away, and he'd let her, both too stubborn to bridge the gap. Now, years later, here they were, her, married to a man whose love came with conditions, and him, the enigmatic billionaire hosting a charity gala for a cause she'd once championed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Julian's foundation was raising funds for emerging artists, a nod to the passion they'd once shared. Elise wondered if he'd chosen the cause deliberately, a quiet message to her across the years. The night wore on, and the tension between Victor and Elise grew palpable. He'd caught her glancing at Julian during his opening speech, and his mood darkened. "You're awfully quiet tonight," he muttered, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Something on your mind?" Elise forced a smile, her fingers tightening around her clutch. "Just enjoying the evening," she lied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. She could feel Julian's presence, a gravitational pull she couldn't ignore, even as Victor's hand pressed harder against her spine. The tipping point came during a lull in the festivities, when the band paused and the crowd thinned as guests drifted toward the auction tables. Elise excused herself to the powder room, needing a moment to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of Victor's scrutiny. She didn't see him follow her, didn't notice the way his eyes narrowed as he caught sight of Julian watching her from across the room. In the hallway, away from the prying eyes of the gala, Victor's facade cracked. "You think I don't see it?" he hissed, grabbing her arm. "The way you look at him. The way he looks at you. I'm not an idiot, Elise." She yanked her arm free, her heart pounding. "You're imagining things," she said, her voice low but firm. "This is about you, not him. Don't lie to me." His voice rose, echoing in the empty corridor. Before she could respond, his hand lashed out, a sharp slap across her cheek that sent her stumbling back. The sting was immediate, but the shock was worse, a betrayal that cut deeper than the physical pain. Her hand flew to her face, tears prickling her eyes as she stared at him, disbelief warring with anger. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Julian appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable but his eyes blazing. "Get your hands off her," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a blade. Victor turned, his face flushed with rage and alcohol. "This is none of your business, Hawthorne," he spat. "She's my wife." "Not for long," Julian said, stepping closer. His presence was a force, calm but unyielding, and Elise felt the air shift, the balance of power tilting. "You don't deserve her." Victor laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "And you do. The great Julian Hawthorne, slumming it with my wife because you couldn't keep her the first time." Elise's heart raced, her cheek still burning, but she found her voice. "Stop it, both of you," she said, stepping between them. "This isn't about your egos. Victor, you crossed a line. You don't get to touch me like that. Ever." Victor's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Julian spoke again. "Elise, you don't have to stay with him. You never did." The words hit her like a revelation, stirring something she'd buried long ago. She'd married Victor because he'd offered stability, a way out of the uncertainty that had defined her early years. But stability had come at a cost: her freedom, her voice, her sense of self. She'd convinced herself it was enough, that love could be built on compromise. Now, standing between the man who'd hurt her and the man who'd once loved her, she saw the lie she'd been living. "I'm done," she said, her voice steady now, her resolve hardening. She turned to Victor, her gaze unflinching. "I'm leaving you. Tonight." Victor's face contorted, a mix of shock and fury. "You can't just walk away," he said, stepping toward her. "You're carrying my child." Julian moved to intercept, but Elise held up a hand, stopping him. "It's my child too," she said. "And I won't let you use that to control me anymore." The hallway felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken truths. Victor's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't advance. Julian's presence was a deterrent, a silent promise of consequences. Elise turned to him, her eyes softening for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I need to handle this." Julian nodded, stepping back but not leaving, his gaze never leaving Victor. Elise took a deep breath, her mind racing. She'd spent years suppressing her own strength, molding herself to fit Victor's expectations. But Julian's words had cracked something open, a reminder of the woman she'd been before, the one who'd painted with abandon, who'd laughed without fear, who'd loved without reservation. She walked away from both men, her heels clicking against the marble, each step a declaration of independence. The gala was still in full swing, but she felt detached from it, as if the glittering world she'd inhabited was a stage she no longer belonged on. She slipped out a side door, the cool night air a shock against her skin. Her cheek still stung, but the pain was secondary to the clarity that had settled over her. In the days that followed, Elise moved quickly. She contacted a lawyer, filed for divorce, and secured a restraining order against Victor. The news spread like wildfire through the city's elite, whispers of the Gala incident trailing her like smoke. Victor's reputation took a hit, his carefully curated image tarnished by his own actions. Elise didn't care about the gossip, she was focused on rebuilding her life, on protecting her unborn child from a man who'd shown his true colors. Julian reached out, not with grand gestures but with quiet support, a phone call to check on her, an offer to connect her with a trusted attorney, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She didn't know if she could trust him, not yet. Their history was a minefield, and she wasn't ready to step back into it. But his presence was a comfort, a tether to a version of herself she was only beginning to reclaim. Elise rented a small apartment in Brooklyn, far from the Manhattan penthouse she'd shared with Victor. She started painting again, her brushstrokes bold and unapologetic, each canvas a step toward healing. The baby kicked inside her, a reminder of the future she was building, not just for herself but for her child. She didn't know what lay ahead, whether Julian would be part of it, whether she'd ever fully escape the shadow of her past, but for the first time in years, she felt free. As she stood in her new studio, paint smudged on her hands, she realized that the gala hadn't just been a breaking point, it had been a rebirth. Victor's slap had shattered the illusion of her marriage, and Julian's presence had reminded her of her own strength. She was no longer the millionaire's wife or the billionaire's ex. She was Elise, and that was enough.